How's everyone this morning? Very good. My name is Cliff Lipscomb. I'm the Director of Economic Research at Greenfield Advisors. We are headquartered in Seattle, Washington, here in the United States, and then we also have a second office in suburban Atlanta in a city of Cartersville, just about an hour from here, where we have a small staff of 5. We're a 40-employee firm. We do property valuation primarily, and that's the space in which we operate. It's very interesting to be here today at a conference about petrochemistry and chemical engineering, considering my only affiliation with those two fields would be through my research in fracking and unconventional shale gas and oil development. I've got one journal article and a couple of book chapters that have come out in the last couple of years. I brought this one up just simply for reference. This is one of the book chapters. This book was published earlier this year. It's called The Economics of Unconventional Shale Gas Development, and it's through Springer, the publisher Springer. And we have a chapter in here. There's also chapters in here about the Marcellus Shale up in Pennsylvania, about the Eagle Ford Shale in Texas, and it does a really nice job of covering, in terms of geography, what's going on in the United States in terms of unconventional shale development at the time. It's published in early 2015, and we actually have another book coming out next year that talks about global issues. We've got a chapter on Japan. We've got a chapter on, we got some chapters about Western Europe, if anybody's from that part of the world. And I encourage you to take a look at it and contact me if you have any questions. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the work. This is an extension of some of our work in unconventional shale. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is just simply an idea. It's nothing that's been published. There's no data or regression analyses or machine learning or any of those big data type concepts that we typically deal with in our work. This is simply an idea. And the idea sprung from some of the work that we've done in the past, and then also conversations with our federal Environmental Protection Agency employees and what they're seeing in terms of trends. And I hope that most of you, having looked at some of the abstracts for the next couple of days, most of you being in the chemistry field, I hope you get something out of this, given that I'm an economist by training. So real quickly, like I said, we're a 39-year-old firm. We focus mostly on real estate valuation. And a recent cool project that we've done, we do a wide variety of things, but one of the things that would be most relevant, I think, to you guys would be we were asked to value a lease at a liquid asphalt plant recently. This was up in Ohio, and my job was to go in and estimate what was a reasonable rent level for the land underlying a liquid asphalt terminal. So that gives you just a little bit of a flavor of the types of things that we do, and I'm happy to discuss the breadth of our issues. Joshua Salisbury is with me today. He's our head of new business initiatives for the firm, and we have that nice little table in the back if you'd like to chat us up and learn about the other things that we do, which include J1 foreign researcher visas. We don't do the visas themselves, but we provide the research to support those. If that's something you're interested in, please chat with one of us before we leave today. So here's the basic issue as we see it. And again, this is an idea. This is not something that's been published yet. And this is more of what I think is going to happen in the future as it relates to fracking and the land that's involved with unconventional shale development. Currently, in the United States, there are 1.1 million active oil and gas wells. And that's everything from that includes conventional and unconventional, and it includes oil and gas. This covers the entire country, virtually. Powder River Basin to the Bakken, to the Marcellus Shale, to the Eagle Ford Shale, which is a little bit closer to, Russell's area there in El Paso. When these active wells, when they're in operation, behind the scenes, there's a lot of different things going on. There are leases involved where an operator will come in and obtain what's called the mineral rights or the subsurface rights to the property where the actual fracking or the unconventional development is going to occur. There's mineral rights. There's limited access to the surface rights, because if you can imagine, these wells have to go somewhere on the surface for the drilling to occur. So there's issues with surface and subsurface. There's separate valuation issues which require an entirely separate discussion. But for our purposes here, the basic question that's being contemplated is, when these wells have exhausted their life, what happens next? That's the question that I'm basically asking. What happens if a well runs dry? What happens if a well is abandoned for economic reasons? We've already heard today several people talk about oil prices and how they're at a local minimum, if you will, and how they're so low relative to the last couple of years. Well, we know from anecdotal evidence, we know from talking with people, operators in the field, we know that they have really scaled back on new well drilling, as well as scaled back some of their current production. And so all these questions kind of come together in this way. What happens down the road when these wells become abandoned or they're no longer operational? And how is that going to affect what happens next in terms of seeking funding to get that land back to a different use? In other words, there's going to be a change. Will there be a change in its highest and best use? What can that property reasonably accommodate in terms of a use of the property in the future? How many of you, can a quick show of hands, how many of you have been to an unconventional shale or gas site? 2 people. Okay, I'm the third because I just visited one in Pennsylvania about 3 weeks ago. It's a very interesting thing to see. At least in Pennsylvania, these wells are in what used to be a very bucolic, serene farm area, and now all of a sudden, literally, you can be this really nice area. You round the corner, and bam, there's a well, and it's at least 100 feet tall, I think. And being on top of one of these things is very impressive. People who work on those wells are very committed to what they're doing. They have very unusual schedules where they're on for 2 weeks and off for a week. A lot of them at the well I visited came from Texas and Oklahoma, although we were in Pennsylvania. So they're away from their families for extended periods of time. So there's all sorts of other cultural, socioeconomic issues that we could also discuss. But for my purposes here, what I want to leave you with in the idea is, when these wells are no longer operational, what happens to the dirt after that? So this leads to the natural question, well, if you're going to redevelop property, what are your options? There's obviously the private investment part of this. There is the lease aspect of this, which is really interesting, where if you give somebody mineral rights to your property, how long can those mineral rights last? How long does that access last? From what I understand, in some areas, like in Eagle Ford and Marcellus, for example, those mineral rights can extend for hundreds of years. In some cases, there is no end in some of these leases. Companies, when they come in, when they send their landmen around and obtain these leases for the mineral rights, sometimes there's not an end period. There's not an end. So it's in perpetuity. And so that really questions, well, what could reasonably be done with this land in the future? So putting that question to the side as well, the main question I want to address today is, how does this impact, or how is this going to impact brownfield funding available at the federal level and then also at the state level? So those are the 2 dots that I'm trying to connect to, again, with this idea. When this land is no longer able to be used for unconventional shale development, is that going to push some of this property into the category of, is this classified as a brownfield or not? And if it is classified as a brownfield, that makes it eligible for all certain tax credits, other grants from the federal EPA and the state EPs, the state environmental protection divisions around the country. And so that could create this huge demand for funding to be able to restore these lands back to some other use. So those are the 2 pieces that I'm trying to connect with this presentation. First slide I want to show you, the first graph I want to show you today, this is, I pulled this off of the Energy Information Administration. This is the EIA. It's a U.S. government agency. Department of Energy. What we've got here is the U.S., these are gas-producing wells in the country. And this goes up through 2014, I believe, and we're looking at right about 500,000. These are just the gas-producing wells. So you can see how this has increased over time, little blips here and there, but for the most part, you can see that there's been a fairly general increase in gas wells actually producing gas over time. So that's the U.S. trend. If we then go to the state trend, some state trends, I call these key states. These were not really systematically picked. These tended to be the top quintile in terms of states and the number of producing wells in those particular states. So you can see we've got states on here like New Mexico, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Oklahoma, and one of the obvious ones left off of here is Texas. Well, no, Texas is on there. I'm sorry, it's on the right-hand side. You can see the states have quite a bit of state-level variation. It doesn't. The overall trend in the United States does not really describe each individual state very well. But you can see Texas has a general increase that would mirror the United States as a whole. You can see that West Virginia has a similar trend, again with more volatility along the way, but a general increase overall. You can see the same thing in New Mexico, although we see a sharp dip in New Mexico after the year 2010. From what I understand, there was some change in legislation in New Mexico that occurred in 2010 as a result of that dip, but I would want to confirm that before anybody quoted me on that. And then we've got Oklahoma and Pennsylvania, and it's a little difficult to see here, but Pennsylvania has had a very sharp increase since about 2008 and 2009, more of an increase than anybody else. And that's due to the Marcellus Shale. You've got operators up there like Range Resources, you've got EQT, doing a lot of work in the area. The well that I happened to visit a couple of weeks ago was operated by EQT, and very educational, big learning experience for me. And, folks are really committed to what they're doing there, that's for sure. All right, so here's the basic research question with all that background. The classical definition of a brownfield involves several components. Is it real property? Is there actual or potential contamination? However you define that. Are there reuse or redevelopment issues? And so then the question becomes, does this make a property eligible for funding if it meets the definition of a brownfield? And so I think this has got global relevance. We had a gentleman earlier talking about the reason he comes to this conference is because it's global. So while fracking, while fracking itself may not be popular in Western Europe, although it's been tried in Scotland and some places in England so far, it's not popular in Western Europe. It's getting some attention in Japan. It's getting some attention in China. It's very heavily done here in the United States. So while it's not global in that respect, this idea is. Everybody's got a brownfield. You may think of it as an abandoned gas station on your corner. You may think of it as a dry cleaner that's abandoned. You may think of it as an automobile salvage yard. Everybody's got these things no matter where you live. So that part of it is global and does have a global reach. The question I'm asking here is, though, do abandoned unconventional shale properties now qualify under the Brownfields Act, at least here in the United States? Does it qualify for a brownfield and then therefore make that property eligible for funding? And what's that going to look like down the road? Let me give you a real short history of the Brownfields Act here in the United States. CERCLA was passed, I believe, in the, 70s. Can anybody correct me on that? It's the Comprehensive Environmental Reclamation Liability Act. I believe it was passed in the 70s. It was amended in 2002, specifically the Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfield Revitalization Act. It clarifies liability for new owners who were not responsible for the original contamination on the site. I've already mentioned to you where you might see actual or potential contamination: illegal drug labs, former gas stations, salvage yards, these kinds of things. Those would qualify as brownfields under the current definition. So what is this going to do to the supply of and the demand for funding over time? So with 1.1 million active wells in this country alone, I think the potential for there to be a huge demand for funding, for brownfield funding, is going to escalate over time as people try to decide what to do with these properties once unconventional shale activities are no longer occurring. And again, I gave this talk about a year ago at a brownfields conference in Oklahoma, and the response that I got from EPA officials there was, well, yeah, it sounds like this would definitely qualify under the brownfields definition. But then the question becomes, well, how is that current limited funding going to be allocated? And what kinds of projects for brownfield funding would be approved at the federal and or the state level? So you've got two issues here. Anytime you're dealing with an economics issue, you've got a supply issue, a supply side, and a demand side. Obviously, the supply of funding over time is going to depend on the various states and whatever the Federal Environmental Protection Agency does. If it perceives this to be a need, then obviously funding could be increased over time. However, on the demand side, there's tons of factors to consider on the demand side. You've got property owners and whether or not they're willing to take the steps to say, you know what, I've got this is my property. Fracking has occurred in the past, for example. Now I want to use some available federal funding to be able to change its use or to put it into another use. So that, in other words, it's a way of, I think of it as a way that homeowners, that property owners can somehow not incur as many costs as they would otherwise if they want to change the use of a property from its unconventional shale use back to some other use, whatever that may be, whatever the property owners decide to do with it. The other thing on the demand side that's interesting is that the typical well lifespan, at least the ones that I've seen and the stuff that I've read, 7 to 15 years is the average. The average well lifespan is somewhere in that period of time. So anything that happened in 2008 would start to come offline about now in terms of there's no more gas available, there's no more oil available, so we're going to have to shut down operations, now what? And you really ask that next question, now what? So again, this is an idea, and so we're going to start to see over time what's going to happen in the coming years as wells that were drilled in 2007, 2008 are no longer operational. Now what's going to be done with the land as these wells exhaust their lifespan, so to speak. And then the more interesting question, I think, is do property owners even realize this may be an option for them? Let's move to the funding side very quickly. Here's a real quick snapshot of the EPA brownfield funding trends. I don't know how familiar you guys are with, estimation software. I'm assuming y'all do some of this in your work. I used a simple program called Stata. It's a commercially available statistics package. I went to the EPA website. I took every category of EPA funding that exists and just simply aggregated it together and lumped it together. I did not separate. There's like 6 different categories of funding, and I literally lumped them all together to be able to produce this chart here. You can see that there was a spike in funding in 2009, and I think that was an anomalous year because if you look at the 5 or 6 years before and after that year, you can see that they generally, within, I'd say 10 or 20%, they generally hovered around the same level. The 2015 number at the end is as of last week. And so by the end of the year, there's a chance that the funding, the grants that are authorized by EPA could reach their 2014 levels, but we're not close. We're not quite there yet. So here's the question. What's going to happen as these wells become abandoned? Are we going to see spike? Are we going to see more increases in time in funding demands? And is the government going to respond by offering more funds? Here's a quick case study of Pennsylvania. We've done a lot of work in the Marcellus Shale. I told you about the well that I was able to visit, the well site I was able to visit a couple of weeks ago. We've written on the subject in the Marcellus area in a couple of our chapters, a couple of our published works. A lot of volatility in Pennsylvania has occurred in terms of, these are brownfield funds from the federal government that have gone to entities in the state of Pennsylvania between 1996 and 2015. And you can see Pennsylvania, for example, this is a relatively high year for EPA funds to be received in Pennsylvania compared to the last 2 years. A lot of this, I believe, is coming from and I'm not up on the details that I should be, but you would need to know about it if you're doing work in Pennsylvania. There's a legislation called Act 13 that has had a lot of debate. It went in front of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. It has to do with the degree to which a local municipality can reauthorize a land use that may be somewhat contradictory to that would be somewhat contradictory to another authorizing jurisdiction. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, you may have one area that's covered by multiple jurisdictions, and so the question is, which one trumps? Does the local trump the state? Does the state trump the local? And so there's been a lot of debate about that. I don't know the outcome. I think it was resolved a couple of months ago, but I think that one of the reasons you're seeing such an uptick this year in EPA brownfield funding, maybe in response to Act 13, it wouldn't have anything to do with this whole brownfield designation that I'm talking about here. But you can see that levels are back up to 2012, and we're not quite through with the year 2015 yet. So what's happened in terms of abandoned wells? There's not a lot of research on this. Again, this is research in its infancy. Kang is a published dissertation. I believe it's out of Princeton University. He used Pennsylvania as a case study. And in that study, I've got the web address here if you'd like to access it. But this study, along with some other things that are coming out of the state of Pennsylvania's website, are talking about the trends that they're starting to see in what are called abandoned wells. I should qualify this by saying that an abandoned well is a subset, or I'm sorry, an orphaned well is a subset of an abandoned well. So think of an abandoned well as kind of the umbrella concept. An orphaned well is some subset of that. At the end of the day, the difference is a well that's operating that all of a sudden is shut down for economic reasons or for any other reasons. It sits there and it lies dormant until it's needed again. So that's that's an abandoned well. Abandoned does not mean it's done with production. It just simply means it's not being used for production currently. According to the state of Pennsylvania's website, there's only 12,000 abandoned wells, yet other sources cite 300 to 500,000. So there's some discrepancies in terms of where in the process that number is being calculated. So that's an important thing to know and to realize. There are some discrepancies, but again, it has to do with the process and where the number is being captured. There's also this Marcellus Legacy Fund, which was part of the Act 13 that I referred to earlier. And there's some dollars there that can be used to close an abandoned well or an orphan gas well. But again, this is Pennsylvania specific, and it doesn't have a direct relationship to the EPA brownfield funding that I was discussing earlier. Here are some of the new wells that are being drilled in Pennsylvania. And so, again, without going into a lot of detail here, the basic question that the basic idea that I'm trying to plant is, you've got lower oil prices currently. You've got slowdowns occurring in terms of new well development. And so the question is, does this current slowdown because of the oil price situation, is that going to give these funding sources time to adjust? And I don't have a clear answer. Folks that I talk to don't have a clear answer, but they're thinking about the idea, I guess is what I'll leave you with. There's considerable debate going on in terms of where all this is going to go, and like I said, around the kitchen table, there's a lot of debate going on about this issue. Let me conclude by saying this. I appreciate your attention today. You know, there's, as we've said, there's a lot of abandoned wells that are going to be coming online in the next couple of years, especially given the fact that the average well lifespan is between 7 and 15 years, depending on where you are in the country. For those of you that are, how many folks are from the United States? Should have asked this earlier. Just a couple? Okay, for those of you not from the United States, this may not mean as much, but you know, with our current low interest rate environment here in the U.S., brownfields, and in particular brownfield investments, continue to be an attractive alternative to investors. If you can get your funding sources lined up, if you can take advantage of the programs that already exist, and if the funding is going to, there's a lot of ifs, but if the funding is also going to be there in the future from these different sources, brownfields are an attractive investment alternative. And in the past, our firm has helped people with these, you know, walk through these issues. What is going to be that change in cap rate? How much are you going to have to invest in getting the property up to a certain investment grade, if you will, depending on what you want to do with the property. So there's a lot of issues there that need to be addressed, but a lot of it hinges on whether or not that funding is going to be there. And then finally, I'll just say that if we continue to experience low oil prices like we have, you know, we would kind of expect that we would expect that this might slow down the development of new unconventional shale fracking sites, which would then bring fewer abandoned sites online. So you can see that there is a progression here that has to occur in a series of events that have to occur for all of this to happen the way that I've kind of got it laid out here. At the end of the day, the connection is what's going to happen with all these operational sites. Is the government, federal and state, going to respond in terms of funding? And again, it's an issue that certainly needs to be thought about now. There's some research being done on it, but it's something that's going to get a lot more press and discussion as the years go on. Thank you very much.